Well, I had a couple people ask me if we were going to ever preach about Santa Claus. I don't know if this is that sermon. I first encountered that reading from Kenny Wiley that Christine read to us this morning in a Facebook post. He posted this on Facebook last year, and this post became popular, really popular. It was shared thousands and thousands of times. So much so that it was picked up by the Boston Globe as an op-ed piece, and that's the version that we heard this morning. So in it, my friend Kenny, who is a 24-year-old, or was at the time, 24-year-old seminarian at Harvard Divinity School, African-American man, finds himself in a t-shirt and shorts running to catch a bus at the Harvard Square station. As he's running down the street, somebody yells out to him, "You running from the cops?" He stops, and somebody else says, "What'd you steal this time?" So Kenny stops and tries to have an encounter, a confrontation really, about why this was inappropriate and offensive, and he's told that he should get over it and learn to take a joke. In fact, somebody actually says to him, "Well, what'd you think we were going to say? You were a black guy running at night." He stops, and his request to us, not to them, his request to us is that we stop pretending that racism is over in America. He asks us to stop pretending that it's not easier to be a man than it is to be a woman in our country, that it's not easier to be white than it is to be black, that it's not easier to be straight than it is to be gay in our America today. And I wondered when we heard the words of Martin Luther King this morning in that speech, in which he focuses on these interrelated issues in his mind of racism, materialism and poverty, and violence, what he would have to say to us if he was invited to preach from our pulpit. I wonder if MLK, if he were alive and well, would get into our pulpit and say to those of us, "Congratulations, you've done a great job, relax." Okay, you don't think so either. Would he say to us, "Congratulations, the people out there continue to be racist and deal with these issues, but I'm so glad that none of you do"? I don't think so. I think that when he's talking about poverty and racism and violence and war, he would have plenty to say on January 20th, 2013. Look at the year we've just experienced. 2012 was the year of Trayvon Martin's shooting, and a shooting in a Sikh temple by a white supremacist. It was the year of one of the most deadly acts of violence in America perpetrated in an elementary school, where we're having a public debate about the role of weapons in our society, where we had a long, prolonged presidential debate in which we talked a lot about the middle class, and I rarely heard anybody talk about the poor from either party. Here we are in a congregation where I know 7th and 8th graders in our congregation who have never lived when America was not at war. I think Martin Luther King would have something to say to us. What we read this morning intentionally was not "I have a dream." I think most of us are familiar with that. Most of us have an easy time agreeing with the words of that, and they feel like a world long gone. What we read this morning was instead his sermon called Beyond Vietnam, which I think less people know. Is anybody familiar with that before today? Okay, a couple. So here's this sermon that he gives exactly 1 year to the day before he's assassinated. He's in the historic Riverside Church in New York City. He's preaching to a packed house. This place fits a lot more than our church does, and the place is packed, standing room only, filled with clergy and lay people who have concerns about the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. In this sermon, King doesn't hold any punches. This is not the soaring rhetoric of "I have a dream." This is the direct language of a man who believes it's his moral duty to speak out against his government's involvement in a war. He's as clear as he can possibly be in his language. He says that any country that continues to spend more money on weapons than it does helping poor people is spiritually sick. And then he says we have to go beyond Vietnam to something that got him in more trouble. See, what got King in trouble at this time in his life was he started to connect racism, poverty, and violence. He was saying that every bomb purchased and sent overseas to kill other human beings was money being taken out of a jobs program in the United States for poor people. King was publicly saying that there were black, brown, and white soldiers fighting together to secure rights overseas that they would not enjoy when they came back home. He said that there are what he called the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism and violence that he said were deeply ingrained in our life, and we had to undergo a radical revolution of values to become a person-oriented society and not a thing-oriented society. And especially for a person of my age, I think it's easy to forget a lot about who he was. First of all, he was younger than I am now when he organized the famous bus boycott. And he was younger than Daniel is when he was murdered. I think it's easy for a person of my generation and a lot of us to forget that King's message was a controversial, complicated, complex, dangerous message to the status quo of his day, and I would add ours. When I grew up, we had a wonderful holiday set aside for a man who, in my mind, was synonymous with justice and civil rights, a man beloved, I thought, by all. And I look back and see, in the last year of his life, King had a 70% disapproval rating, including a majority of the black community in America. He began to equate and connect racism, poverty, war, and violence together, and this did not go over well. He lost friends and political allies, including the President of the United States. He had a 70% disapproval rating. Money started not coming in anymore to his organizational efforts. He was being spied on by the U.S. government. His phones were tapped. Counterintelligence programs were being used against him at times directly to subvert the work he was doing. He was being labeled a traitor and a communist on television and in newspapers. But that's not the message of Martin Luther King that I got growing up. And it's not the side of the story we normally think about. You see, I think it's so tempting for us to want to make our prophets safe, to want to distance their message from us, to want to pretend that they're not talking to me or my time, that they have a very nice, robust justice message about somebody else. And that resonates with us, I see. You see, we do this to Jesus, right? The largest cultural celebration we have about the person Jesus is the infant in the manger. Love come down. In America, we actually rarely talk about the radical prophet whose only comments about money suggested we're best off by giving every cent of it we have away. In America, we rarely talk about the radical adult teacher Jesus who said that we would find the kingdom of God in the poorest, sickest, most outcast people we could possibly find. That the life of fullness and glory and grace would be found living with criminals and prostitutes. That's not the Jesus we hear about on TV. That's not the Jesus we string up lights for. The infant in the manger does not have much to tell me about how I should live my life today. And I think we so easily do the same thing with Martin Luther King. He was a great man who 50 years ago had a robust message for people back then who needed to hear it. But I think it's different now. It's more complicated now. Part of the reason why Kenny's words were so difficult for me to read the first time is because they weren't about some world a long time ago and some people I didn't know that I could easily blame. They weren't those images from the civil rights era where I could clearly point and say, oh, racism, not racism. Images where I could clearly point back and say, I know I would have been on the right side of history. Kenny's talking to me. What stood out to me is so amazing is how similar our stories are, except for some very important differences. Kenny and I both went to Southern colleges and went immediately to Harvard Divinity School afterward. We were both 24-year-old leaders of our student bodies at the school. I've run down those same streets in my t-shirt and shorts with a bag slung over my shoulder trying to catch that bus. And I never had an encounter like that. And Kenny points to the reason why. His skin is black and mine is white. He's asking me to admit something. That it's not over. That it's easier to be a man in our society than it is to be a woman. That it's easier to be straight than it is to be gay. That it's easier to be white than it is to be black. And both he and King come to this conclusion from a place of their faith, right? This is a religious argument on their part, and I think it is because at the core, our faith affirms that you have a profound impact on the human beings that you share this earth with. It's precisely because of who you are. You have a profound impact, not people, you. In the color of your skin, in your gender, in your sexuality, with your life experiences. And Kenny and King are asking us to be mindful of this tool. You know, we were given this church. We were given Unitarian Universalism, this tradition which is vibrant and open and affirming. We were given this church which is so good at welcoming people in only because other people fought really hard to make it so. We should not pretend that it was easy for Unitarians and Universalists to discuss whether or not to support the abolition of slavery in the 1800s. It was not. We should not tell a simple story about that. There were Unitarians and Universalists on both sides of that debate. And it was not easy at all for Boston Unitarians to argue against slavery when many of the churches there were built on cotton money. It was not easy at all for our traditions to have a debate about what it meant for women to have full inclusion in our churches and our ministry and society. Some people left the church over that so that other people could have a seat. And we should not pretend that it was easy in any way for our tradition to negotiate what it meant for gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgendered individuals to have a full place at the table in our churches and in the world. And we're still dealing with a lot of that. None of these issues are over, right? And I want so badly for us to give the next people that walk in the door, the next generation, a Unitarian Universalism and a church here in Dallas that is as vibrant and robust because we were courageous to take a good, hard look at ourselves. That we knew we don't have to agree, that we don't have to think alike to love alike. I want the next generation of people who come in here to say thank you to us for being willing to be as courageous as people were about other issues. Of course, at the center of all of this is that truth. That you have a profound effect on other human beings. Whether you know it or not. Kenny asks me to admit the difference in the way I move through the world based on the color of my skin. That there is privilege given to me based on nothing else but the color of my skin. That even though I would not say I'm involved in overt racism, I benefit by being white. And sometimes it's in really subtle ways. But the message is clear. I'm normal and other people are other. When I go into the grocery store to buy Band-Aids and they're flesh-colored, whose flesh are they colored? Mine. When I go into the grocery store to buy shampoo, I go into the shampoo section, not the ethnic section. I open a history book and I see people who look and sound a lot like me doing wonderful things for our culture and being praised for it. I can move throughout America and see images of God that consistently look like me. That's a strong statement about this privilege. Nobody ever asks me to speak for all white people. I have never in a job interview, never worried at all that the color of my skin would affect the outcome of that. I have never worried not 1 second that when I was applying for a home loan or an auto loan, that the color of my skin would have any negative impact on that decision. My parents and their parents made use of federal loans for their homes and jobs and programs that many people's parents and grandparents were actively shut out of. I think what Kenny's asking me to do is to be as mindful about the body I move through the world in as I possibly can. And I don't think it's just a message for people with my color skin or my gender or my sexual identity. I think the core of this issue is to say, you, just as you are, deeply affect other human beings. See, as Daniel said last week in his sermon, our church is about deeds, not creeds. That we care a lot more about what you do than what you say you believe. And if that's true, then there's no separation between the spiritual life and the body you live in. You are the best resource you have to love and serve the world. And that means that when we pay attention to issues of race and class and ability and poverty and violence and war, what we're being asked to do is to be as mindful as we possibly can with the bodies we move through the world in. This is hard. It's uncomfortable, and it's difficult, and nobody really wants to talk about it. But it's a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual issue which says we wake up to the very real impact that we have on the world. That we wake up to how the world is ordered and how we want to respond to it. Like Kenny said in his reading, talking about race in the 21st century is complex. Nothing straightforward. But I think as individuals, as we move forward, we have to carry with us the tools of courage, humility, and grace. Courage says we're willing to never say we're done with prophets. That we have the courage to look at the issues that our ancestors in this tradition did. Humility says that we admit something Unitarian Universalists have to admit, that everyone's experience of the world simply is not the same. And that's a good thing. That we approach others and their experience of the world through a place of listening and curiosity. And of course, I think we have to carry grace with us in this, because the end goal of any of this work is not so that we can judge others or ourselves. The end goal is so that we might build the beloved community on earth. Now, in our church, we do have a few opportunities coming up in the next few weeks, actually, to explore these issues in a robust and spiritual way. The Women's Day Alliance, in their first meeting in February, is going to be studying racism in Dallas and its effects. And I'm sure they would love to have visitors. Leisha Brooks from the Southern Poverty Law Center will be preaching here in a couple of weeks in our pulpit to talk to us about these issues, and she'll be working all weekend with our youth, our teenagers, on issues of racism and classism in their lives. Our Yes theme year is designed for us to be actively engaged in crossing the boundaries of creed, culture, and class. Take up the invitation to go to the Bridge homeless shelter to find out who's poor in Dallas and why. Take up the invitation to go with our community track to pack food at the food bank and learn about just how many people go hungry in this city. Just how interrelated these issues of race and class, poverty, and violence are in the city we live in today. Deep down inside is this difficult truth. You matter. You deeply, deeply matter. With the skin that you're in and the gender you're in and the ways you've been hurt and the experiences you've had and the mistakes you've made, you deeply matter, not in spite of who you are, but precisely because of what you bring to the table. And so this is all an invitation for us to use that tool as mindfully as we possibly can. To make real the beloved community on earth, conversation by conversation, Sunday by Sunday, action by action. I think that the best way we can honor Martin Luther King and his legacy on this Sunday, January 20th, 2013, is not to let him be safe for us, but to let him be challenging and dangerous, complicated and controversial for us. think it's a worthy call for any church, and most certainly ours. May you have courage and humility and grace in all that you do, knowing the profound impact you have on others. May it be well with you and your soul, my friends.